So hello everyone, why don't we get started? So thank you everyone for coming this evening. I'm Nicholas Baer, I'm an assistant professor in the German department here at Berkeley, and I'm also affiliated with the Center for Jewish Studies. And I'd first like to thank the Center for Jewish Studies and the Helen Diller Institute for co-hosting tonight's talk. And special thanks to Jennifer Lipscomb and Etta Heber for all of their work in facilitating tonight's event. So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Boaz Hagin. Hagin is chair of the Graduate Film Studies program at the Steve Tisch School of Film and Television at Tel Aviv University. And over the past decade and a half, Hagin has established himself as a leading voice in film and media studies on Israeli and American cinema, along with issues of film theory and philosophy, ethics, memory, and trauma. Hagin's first book, Death in Classical Hollywood Cinema, appeared in 2010, and this book is a philosophical examination of death across a wide range of Hollywood genres. And together with Thomas Alsasser, Hagin wrote another book on US cinema entitled Memory, Trauma, and Fantasy in American Cinema, which appeared in Hebrew in 2012. And in addition to these two monographs, Hagin has co-edited 2 volumes as well, Just Images, Ethics and the Cinematic, which appeared in 2011, and Deeper Than Oblivion, Trauma and Memory in Israeli Cinema from 2013. And Hagin also serves as co-editor of the book series Depth of Field, which is published by the Steve Tisch School of Film and Television in collaboration with Am Oved. Not least, Hagin has published articles in leading journals, including Camera Obscura, GLQ, Screen, Journal of Film and Video, Jewish Film and New Media, and the Journal of Jewish Identities. Now, over the past years, Hagin has been working on a new project on the discourse of film in Mandate Palestine and Israel. And I've had the privilege to hear and read some of Hagin's work on this topic, and I think his work is really distinguished by 3 special qualities. So one is truly extensive archival research. So Hagin carries on the legacy of the so-called historical or archival turn in cinema and media studies. That is, he looks beyond the films themselves to consider extra filmic sources such as film magazines, journals, memoirs, and daily newspaper columns. In this way, he also radically expands the history of film theory to include a much broader range of ideas and debates about cinema, including the voices of filmmakers, government workers, critics, journalists, and cinephiles. Secondly, Hagin is transnational in his methodology. So scholarship on Israeli cinema has traditionally read films in relation to Israeli history and society, but Hagin emphasizes that Israeli film culture involves transnational co-production networks, global distribution circuits, and effective and material ties to the Jewish diaspora. Finally, Hagin is wonderfully irreverent, so his work questions scholarly orthodoxies and long-standing presuppositions. So rather than assuming that Israeli film functions as a medium of ideological transmission, Hagin emphasizes that the history of Israeli cinema is a tale of critiques, heated disputes, failures, and mishaps. And I think you'll find that Hagin's work is brilliant, eccentric, and often hilarious. So tonight, Hagin will present for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have a good half hour for interactive Q&A, and we hope that as many of you participate in the discussion as possible. His talk is entitled Transnational Visions, Israeli Discourse on Cinema. Please join me in welcoming Boaz Hagin.
Thank you. Before I begin, I would like to thank the Berkeley Center for Jewish Studies and the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies, Nicholas Baer for an amazing introduction. I never knew. And Jennifer Lipscomb for coordinating everything with remarkable patience. This talk, as Nick said, is about a book project I've been working on for far too long, about the way Israelis and members of the Yishuv talked about their own cinema, especially prior to the beginning of academic research on film in the 1970s in Israel. Because my work is on the discourse itself, I would like to begin with a note on terminology. Are there students here from film studies? Not from Israel? Okay. So the State of Israel was established in 1948 following a 30-year period in which the region was under British control. That's Mandatory Palestine. The British took over from the Ottoman Empire in World War I and received a mandate from the League of Nations. At the time, the Jewish community in the region referred to itself as the Yishuv, the community or settlement, a term I will use throughout this talk. In English, they and others called the region Palestine. So Palestinian cinema at the time could have been Jewish Zionist cinema, which is weird. In Hebrew, a cognate of Palestine existed. It was Palestina, but it was very rarely used in the sources I will be discussing today. Members of the Yishuv generally used Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, to describe the territory. Since my interest is in the discourse itself, I will translate it literally as the land of Israel or as Palestine, but at the time they would have translated it as Palestine. So it's a bit confusing. In 1941, a Hebrew film magazine in the Yishuv published a reader's letter about his conversation with celebrated actor Paul Mooney. The reader writes that although Mooney was thousands of miles away in a studio in Hollywood, his voice, which emerged from the deepest recesses of his heart, reached the reader's ears. This fanciful, telepathic communication had nothing to do with the actor's work in cinematic landmarks, such as Scarface and the story of Louis Pasteur. It was about Mooney's Jewishness and his commitment to the Zionist cause. The two were inseparable as far as the letter was concerned, and particularly his contribution to Hebrew filmmaking in the land of Israel. Mooney, or imaginary Mooney, revealed that while many Jews in Hollywood concealed their identity, others were proud of their homeland and origin, exhibited this on every occasion, and were far from being alienated from their nation, which was most dear to them. Indeed, he, his friend Edward G. Robinson, and the Jewish film company of the Warner Brothers were the first to make films against the persecution of the Jews and against the Nazis. After establishing his Jewish bona fides, Mooney turned to answering the question of why he and Hollywood's other proud Jews were not making films in the Yishuv. "We have never forgotten the land of Israel and Hebrew art," he assured the reader. When visiting the land several years earlier, it had even occurred to him to stay and take part in a Hebrew propaganda film. But nothing of value could have been created at the time because the film did not enjoy the support of the institutions of the Yishuv. After the war, World War II, Hebrew film production would develop in the land of Israel, and Mooney was confident that all of his Jewish colleagues would not wash their hands of this important enterprise. Mooney assured the reader that since he and his colleagues did not have sufficient command of the Hebrew language, talented young people from the land of Israel would be able to fill the most responsible roles in the new industry. The letter concludes, "Suddenly his voice became silent, but I think that it still rings in my ears." The reader who sent the letter was awarded a free cinema ticket by the magazine. The Warner Brothers and Paul Mooney never made Aliyah to the land of Israel, and reports about supernatural transatlantic transmissions from the souls of Hollywood actors were rare in the Hebrew press. This letter, however, does raise significant concerns and ideas about local filmmaking that were seriously debated in the Yishuv in Israel. Should moving pictures be in English and appeal to the international market, or in Hebrew and protect the recently revived language from foreign influences? Could the small market support a commercial industry, or would it have to be a nationalized enterprise? More generally, what would be the relations between Israeli Jews and the Jewish diaspora, especially the thriving co-religionists in the United States? Jewish immigration was being severely restricted by the British authorities at the time, but once an independent Jewish state was created, could it secure employment for countless immigrants, and would they drive out local workers? Israelis and members of the Yishuv never hesitated to elaborate ideas about their film industry, its place in the world, and the role prominent Jewish filmmakers and movie stars would have in supporting it as part of more fundamental questions about Zionism. Numerous, sometimes overlapping, and sometimes contradictory ideas were floated to help the industry advance. This project returns to the history of the Yishuvs and Israel's cinema as viewed in Hebrew film magazines, literary and art journals, memoirs, industry publications, books, interviews, and columns in daily newspapers. While always incomplete, sometimes inaccurate, and occasionally eccentric, Their views were often grounded in real dilemmas and revealed notions that did guide filmmaking efforts and even government initiatives. I won't go into it today, but I also consider the films as being in dialogue with this discourse or simply a part of it. They were fascinated by representations and acts of narration and often foregrounded filmmaking, theater, puppet shows, pageants, journalists, pulp fiction, and just people telling each other's stories. Academic scholarship on Israeli cinema appeared in the late 1980s and 90s in highly influential works that divided Israeli cinema into periods and genres and explained the significance of Israeli films within historical processes related to central topics, like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Holocaust. While brilliantly setting the stage for research in the field to this day, these works downplayed the significance of earlier local writings on film. They relied on theoretical frameworks that had already been established in American and European film and cultural studies, notably post-colonialism, feminism, and queer theory. From these theoretically sophisticated perspectives, earlier writings on cinema in Israel appeared naive and methodologically unsound or impressionistic, and it seemed that they had little to contribute to the discussion. One critic even referred to this period as a desolate wasteland or desert of writings on film, and it's a pretty charged term in the history of Zionism. Yet, at the same period that academic scholarship of Israeli cinema appeared, the discipline of film studies in general started to reflect on its very premises and boundaries. The dominant paradigm of film studies that emerged in the 1960s and 70s was questioned in the 1980s and 90s, as were the routines and practices of academic film interpretation and the actual role of theory within them. Two shifts within film studies are particularly germane to this work. One shift is research that shows the diverse publications, institutions, forms, and thinkers who produced and disseminated knowledge about moving images before or outside of the establishment of the academic discipline, and a limited canon of writings up to the 1960s that was recognized as classical film theory. Scholarship looked at the history of knowledge about film and the constitution of the discipline in the British and North American context, in other major centers, and outside the West. Anton Case, Nicholas Baer, and Michael Cohen, for example, overturned our understanding of what and where early film theory was in German. Following this reconsideration of the discipline of film studies, we can no longer simply brush off the early discourse on moving images in the Yishuv in Israel as insufficiently theoretical. Moreover, now that more historical sources have been scanned and indexed, we have access to writings that earlier scholars were not able to locate, and we can no longer assume they were non-existent. News, histories, opinions, and theoretical ideas about moving images were regularly published in the Yishuv in Israel. They appeared in 1930s leisure magazines, the popular film magazines Kolnoa and Olam HaKolnoa, Film Workers Association and union bulletins like HaMasrit, the highbrow film journal, Omanut HaKolnoa. You've probably guessed that Kolnoa is cinema in Hebrew. Books about film like Dr. Menachem Zwanziger's 1946, Kolnoa, and within publications that were not exclusively dedicated to moving images, such as daily newspaper culture and literary sections, and journals that dealt with art, culture, politics, and society in general, like Bamot, Bama, Moznaim, Masa, Mevoot, Prosdor, Hauma, Molad, Ktuvim, Turim, and Orlogin. It was not a desert. This knowledge about film was not peer-reviewed or rigorous, it was not academic, and was rarely theoretical, but it certainly existed. The second shift within film studies in general has been to question the national cinema paradigm. Academic scholarship on Israeli cinema has often postulated a strong connection between Israeli films and Israeli society. To risk a gross simplification, the standard account of Israeli national cinema views Israeli films in relation to a transition from a tight-knit society of dedicated Zionist pioneers and unquestioning patriots to social disintegration, ruled by neoliberalism, cruelty, and violence. Early films depicting the Yishuv were uncritically aligned with the Zionist movement's beliefs and took part in constructing the image of brawny settlers who worked in the fields and were the negation of the old Nebish diasporic Jew. After the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, its patriotic motion pictures glorified the warriors who protected the land and sacrificed their lives so their country could be born and the survivors of the Holocaust could find a homeland. In the 1960s and 70s, the crumbling of Israel's socialist ethos was apparent in personal films that focused on individuals and in popular comedies or bureka cinema, in which members of different Jewish ethnic groups competed against each other within the capitalist free market. With the fall from power of the Labor Party and the rise of the right wing in 1977, filmmakers who belonged to the left-wing elite turned to politically engaged filmmaking that was critical of Israel and Zionism and depicted the plight of its external and internal victims, notably the Palestinians. In this millennium, in the wake of the Second Intifada, the rise of neoliberalism, and the political dominance of populism, Israel's cinema and television reflect a fragmented and polarized society in which various subnational and transnational identities, women, religious and Orthodox Jews, Palestinians, Mizrahi Jews, queers, army veterans, immigrants, kibbutz members, and foreign workers develop their group memories and traumas and can no longer coalesce into one unified Israeli society. References to context outside of Israel have usually been limited within this scholarship. The most significant non-Israeli sources have been European and American film and cultural theories that were applied to Israeli case studies. As the pioneering academic publications on Israeli film adopted the national cinema paradigm, non-Israeli scholarship was already problematizing it. British scholars, for example, noted that Hollywood films had been dominating the British box office for decades. Television had become the preferred venue for seeing films, and attempts to create a popular local film industry had been short-lived. It became pertinent to ask, as Jeffrey Noel Smith wrote, what is British cinema and who needs it? In this millennium, film scholars continued questioning and expanding the national cinema paradigm and exploring ideas like transnational, global, and world cinemas. Scholars of Israeli cinema also began looking at the films from a more transnational perspective. A significant landmark in solidifying this research was Rachel S. Harris and Don Hutin's 2021 anthology that could already boast 17 contributions exploring decades of Israeli and Palestinian films. There are books on Israeli cinema from transnational perspectives and works on transnational cinema that also look at Israel. This turn took place as the presence of Israeli cinema and television outside the country had become hard to miss. In this millennium, Israeli cinema has been highly visible on the International Film Festival circuit and has garnered prizes and nominations in major venues, including the Cannes Film Festival and the Academy Awards. Israeli content like Fauda and Shtisel has become popular on global streaming platforms such as Netflix, Amazon, and Apple TV+. Localized Israeli formats like In Treatment have thrived in the golden age of television. It would have been odd if scholarship had continued to pretend that Israeli moving images were only an issue for Israelis. While it might be tempting to declare a transnational turn in Israeli film studies, I argue that it is more a return than a turn. Israeli discourse on moving images has always been transnational, although academic writing since the 1980s has often downplayed it while emphasizing the connection to the local. Before and outside of this academic corpus, writers were often eager to emphasize dynamics that transcended national boundaries. From the earliest days of filmmaking in the Yishuv, it was noted and often lamented by those who wanted to erect a local industry that numerous local films were actually made by foreign crews who developed, edited, and dubbed the footage abroad, where the films were also primarily screened. Moreover, it was always taken for granted that most films screened in Israel were and always would be foreign. Writers about film were heavily invested in these imports and happy to argue about the merits of various non-Israeli films, filmmakers, and national cinemas, and used them as a valuable framework for understanding local production, distribution, and exhibition. So there was actually a war between proponents of German cinema and Russian cinema well into the 1930s. I don't know who won. But they also used it to discuss their own films. So Italian neorealism and directors like Vittorio De Sica, for example, seemed to signify the possibility of making films that were not as polished and glamorous as Hollywood's productions. In a report about a film made by the Association for Amateur Filmmaking and Art in Israel in 1952, readers were told that it combined documentary images with a narrative and described it as the De Sica method. Another company explained that they were adopting the Italian method of depicting everyday life and shooting on location, which means basically improvising. In an essay about what he called the paradoxes of Israeli cinema, critic and filmmaker Zev Ravnov claimed that the most valuable topics for Israeli cinema, such as immigrant transit camps, ma'abarot, and unemployment, were a good fit for Italian-style realism that criticized reality. But that, since the country was still struggling for its very existence and relied on the support of other nations to guarantee its survival, it was forced to resort to Russian-style socialist realism, which distorted reality and denied any lasting problems. So they were talking about their films using Italy or Russia. As the letter about communicating with Mooney indicates, the way Israelis understood local filmmaking or imagined its future was hardly restricted to examining local society. Rather, it was viewed within global and transnational frameworks. Writing about Israeli filmmaking was typically based on real or fanciful familiarity with foreign film industries and authors could accrue authority from knowledge about the non-Israeli film world. Two transnational points of view frequently came up. One, positional, was about the role Israel or the Yishuv played or could play within larger production, distribution, and exhibition networks. For example, Israel was, and often still is, promoted as a partner for co-productions and as a shooting location for Hollywood runaways and foreign film and television productions. In addition, many believed that the films shot in the Yishuv in Israel would be screened abroad and have propaganda value by spreading the ideas of Zionism and the achievements of the country across the globe. The other transnational point of view was comparative and aimed to understand Israeli cinema by looking at other industries that, according to Israeli writers, were or once had been somehow analogous to its own. The analogy could be that they too had a small local market, their industries were likewise only beginning to develop, or they were also markedly Jewish. During the Yishuv period, Arab films could also be a source of inspiration. Under the title A Proposal for a Hebrew Film, a reader's letter published in a film magazine in 1941 referred to a story about the owner of Rex Cinema in Jerusalem that screened Arab films, who had made an Arab film in Egypt. The reader thought that another, presumably Jewish cinema owner, should make a Hebrew film and make use of the studios in Egypt for the sound and to ensure that the images would be of high quality. Biological metaphors abounded in these comparative accounts. Writers assumed that film industries grew and developed teleologically along a predetermined path. Therefore, a more mature industry in another country could show Israelis, so they believed, what their underdeveloped industry would one day become, thus translating a spatial and cultural distance into a temporal one. A 1933 review, for example, described the local industry as still in its swaddling clothes, but hoped that in the future, once the technical difficulties would be overcome, it would produce films at least as good as those of other countries. A 1941 reader's letter to a magazine turned to the history of American cinema. The current glamorous Hollywood, the letter explained, was once a small town with only a few wretched wooden stages. This, the letter believed, was evidence that the Yishuv's industry could also be on the way to emerging, just as American cinema developed gradually and not all at once. A later letter by a different reader elaborated, "It is a mistake to think that the Hollywood which we see every day in the glamour of its development, with all of its companies and actors, suddenly fell from the sky. The kingdom of the movies also had a beginning, and I do not know if this beginning is not like the beginning in our land." The comparative and positional points of view could and often did appear together. In an unfavorable review of a 1928 film by Jerusalem-based photographer Yaakov Ben Dov, the writer commented comparatively that for us, the art of film might still be in its first stage, bistadiat ha'atchala, and it was therefore encountering difficulties that did not exist in other lands. The review concluded positionally by assessing the film's chances in the world and opined that it would be hard to imagine that it would have much drawing power abroad. Ben Dov, the photographer, responded in a letter to the newspaper, in which he demonstrated that his work did enjoy international success. In both the review and the response, discussing the film's appeal to local viewers never even occurred to the writers. A 1932 article on a new film laboratory in the land of Israel likewise combined the positional and the comparative. It explained that the goals of the first serious filmmakers in the Yishuv were, among others, to show the life of creation in the land of Israel to the wide world and to spread the idea of its revival all across the globe. When the writers saw the film laboratory, he was impressed. "I was in a real film laboratory. Although it was smaller than the laboratories of UFA in Germany and Paramount, it was a laboratory. The technical quality of a negative he was shown was just as good as work done abroad, and the film in the land of Israel had moved on from the diapers of idealist pioneering and proceeded toward becoming a regular industry." The term goy and its plural form goim was often used in these discussions that sometimes toyed with its double meaning. In biblical Hebrew, goy means nation or people, whether Jewish or not, and the biblical phrase kechol hagoyim, like all the nations, resonated with the Zionist desire to turn the diasporic Jewish people into a normal nation like all others. In the context of Israeli cinema, being like all the goyim could be used to refer to films that were on par with filmmaking throughout the globe. A local Hebrew magazine article on the production of Baruch Haggadadi's 1935 This Is the Land proudly noted that this was the first sound film to be made locally from start to finish, unlike previous talkies that were shot by foreign crews and edited and dubbed abroad. After briefly describing Haggadadi's lab, the article announced, "We have a talking cinema, really similar to all of the goyim." The meaning of goy in modern Hebrew and Yiddish is a non-Jew, or a Jew is ignorant of Jewish tradition, and is sometimes, but not always, experienced as dismissive or derogatory. In the context of Israeli cinema, films for the goyim could designate films that would be successful outside of Israel, and more specifically, those that would appeal to a non-Jewish foreign audience, and not merely to the more forgiving Jewish audiences at Zionist fundraisers abroad. Writers frequently called for making films that would also attract these coveted viewers, and were thrilled when they did. In a 1958 interview, for example, Yaakov Davidon, then the chairperson of the Cinema Owners Association in Israel, argued that films could serve as ambassadors in the world, and praised the subject of a recent film for being typical of Israel as it was seen in the speculum of the Goim, Ba'aspaklaria HaGoit. If we consider what members of the Yishuv and Israelis wrote, and especially their transnational point of view, the films are no longer a transparent indication of their ideological beliefs, and a level of opacity or density needs to be added. According to writers, Israeli and Hebrew cinema did not simply convey its society's beliefs, but was a calculated attempt to mirror what Israelis thought non-Israelis wanted Israelis to be, or at the very least, self-express. Well into the 1960s, it was claimed films traded in Zionist shibboleth and jingoist chest thumping, at least in part because they believed that was what viewers abroad wanted to see. To be sure, setting up a film industry was often viewed by film-loving members of the Yishuv and Israelis as a Zionist endeavor that took part in building the Jewish state. There was copious Zionist rhetoric in the surrounding discourse that would not be out of place in the most enthusiastic Zionist propaganda film. It was seen as an industry that would be part of the economy of the Jewish homeland, a celebration of the revived Hebrew language, and a global medium that would carry their achievements to all ends of the earth. In 1945, a film magazine article about a new film company commended its founder as contributing to the building of the land and the resurrection of the people and its culture. The caption below his photograph explained that he espoused the saying, "If you will it, it is no dream," a famous motto by Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism. But this is not the full story. For some, even among the pioneers who made the most blatant Zionist propaganda films, it appears that Zionism was more a justification for an obsession with filmmaking than a carefully thought out position. And Zionism possibly afforded them a path of least resistance for realizing their cinematic dreams in the Yishuv in Israel. The ideology we would need to scrutinize might therefore also be tied to a desire to make and see moving images, a frenzy of the visible, or society of the spectacle, which existed in many places and in which Israel was very much like all the nations. While not all early filmmakers published their memoirs, those that did invariably describe stories in which there's little connection between their passion for filmmaking and their much less pronounced belief in Zionism. In some accounts, their stories read like picaresque narratives in which realizing Zionism seems to have happened almost by chance, such as for Yerushalayim Segal and Margot Klausner. Klausner was the daughter of a family that owned a chain of shoe stores in Germany. She was married off to the son of shoe manufacturers. He happened to be a Zionist. On their honeymoon, she found herself in Palestine. So she had no connection to Zionism, but then produced many Zionist films and built the first studio. Yerushalayim Segal, also an important producer, was a yeshiva student in Europe. He had left his family who remained in Siberia. And one day, a friend of his father's received a letter from his family. He hadn't seen them for years, that they've decided to make Aliyah and go to the land of Israel. If he wanted, he could join. So he thought about it and decided to join them. That was his decision to realize Zionism. So they weren't really passionate Zionists, and they made the propaganda films. Others, like Yaakov Davidon and Natan Axelrod, who made the most famous newsreels, tell rather horrific tales about tensions between the two, between Zionism and filmmaking. They preferred filmmaking, that involve suffering, rape, arrest, and considerable mendacity. Up to the 1960s, Israelis believed that their films suffered from serving as propaganda or advertisements, ta'amula and hasbara. They particularly complained that the films were plagued with what they called Zionism in scare quotes, trite and dated idealizations of the Yishuv or Israel, as well as blunt messaging on behalf of a private or public institutions that finance the films. Some of these films were in English and intended for Zionist fundraising abroad, and Israelis and members of the Yishuv complained that they very rarely even had a chance to view them, and they complained even more when they did. Other films were made for a captive audience of local viewers who, before being shown the foreign movie they paid for, had to endure local sponsored newsreels, commercials, shorts, and various public service films, especially after a 1954 law was passed to support the local industry. It is, of course, possible that some Israeli viewers enjoyed these newsreels and commissioned shorts. Years later, they could appeal to a nostalgic or camp sensibility, and several scholars have brilliantly reevaluated the political and aesthetic contribution of some of these films, such as the late Jad Ne'eman, Shmulik Duvdevani, and Rachel Harris. However, mostly these films were despised by writers across the board: readers' letters, popular magazines, industry publications, filmmaker memoirs, and elitist columnists. There were reports about viewers sighing loudly and whistling. The secretary of the Cinema Owners Association in Israel lambasted the cheap tone of propaganda in Israeli short films, and movie theater owners argued that the audience refused to watch Israeli films, which they claimed were boring. The government official in charge of promoting Israeli cinema at the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Asher Hirschberg, wrote that Israeli films would be successful abroad if they expressed the unique atmosphere of the country, but without too much Zionism. Local wits parodied these Zionist films. One columnist in 1954 proposed a script for a science fiction film in which an alien monster who landed in Israel was defeated by having the Jewish National Fund's latest report being read aloud to it. The monster died of boredom. Another was written as a column honoring the recently deceased Avrasha Schmuckler, a fictitious screenwriter credited with hundreds of imaginary Israeli films. Born in Poland, a mere 40 kilometers from the Russian border, Schmuckler believed that this proximity had left its mark on his work and viewed Eisenstein and Pudovkin as his spiritual teachers. The column ridicules his artistic pretensions and describes some of his screenplays. These include newsreels showing politicians and minor officials visiting hospitals and schools, holding meetings, and giving speeches, in one case to oranges. What could be more Zionist than that? And you have a picture. The author assures readers that although the screenwriter passed away, quote, "The spirit of Avrasha Schmuckler is not dead. His influence can be seen in Israeli cinema in every film that is made here. I am confident and believe that his spirit shall live forever on the screen." Israelis distinguished between these films with too much Zionism in quotation marks and the type of cinema they wanted to make and was being made abroad. These were characterized as movies in reality, Sratim Shel Mamash, the movies of all the peoples, Sirtei Kol HaGoyim, and a real movie, Seret Mamashi, and just a movie, Stam Seret. Hebrew language publications in the Yishuv in Israel frequently debated how to make real movies, often invoking the region's history, geography, and demography as evidence for the possibility, if not inevitability, of building a local film industry. The discourse wavered between bouts of meek skepticism and self-doubt and wildly fantastic delusions of Israeli cinematic entitlement. On the one hand, the thorough acquaintance with foreign cinemas allowed some writers to engage in cruel pessimism that contributed to the feeling that a local industry was an impossible dream. The market for Hebrew films was ridiculously small. The tiny and impoverished country would easily be crushed by larger, better funded, long established, and celebrated cinematic powerhouses. And Israelis had repeatedly failed where other small budget filmmakers attained startling artistic achievements. The same knowledge, however, could also inspire them to act, believe they could learn from other industries, or somehow collaborate with them. If other countries did it, why couldn't they? While many of these discussions were in pragmatic terms, others were less direct or fully articulated. One example is the way they wrote about filmmaking centers, such as Hollywood, as both unapproachable and within reach. A significant portion of the information on Hollywood consisted of outrageous gossip about movie stars. It tended to depict Hollywood as bizarre, populated with movie stars who behaved badly, earned outrageous salaries, and were embroiled in scandalous love lives. They were mocked by Israeli writers and readers, and attempts to imagine Israelis behaving that way were seen as a joke. In letters, many readers doubted that their fan mail to stars would even ever be answered, or that studios even bothered to collect information about viewers in faraway places like Israel. They did. We have documents of that. At the same time, however, magazines also elaborated in great detail how their representatives really met movie stars throughout the globe, and emphasized that they had actual reporters stationed in Europe and Hollywood, and readers doubted that. They wrote it in letters. Signed photographs were often dedicated to the magazine. This says, greetings to Olam HaKolnoa, this is the name of the magazine, Clark Gable. They were dedicated to the magazine, to the readers, mentioned the land of Israel or the state of Israel. Some stories even included photographs of the star with the Israeli reporter, indexical proof that they really met. So this is Olam HaKolnoa's reporter. He's meeting Clark Gable, and he's being reprimanded in the caption for standing with his hands in his pockets in the presence of the king. How dare he? He would actually become an important journalist later. Another option to prove that they really did have access to movie stars. Here we have Edward G. Robinson, who visited Israel in a kind of mise en abîme photograph of Robinson on the cover of a magazine, showing him holding a previous issue of the magazine with Robinson on its cover. All of these provided evidence to readers that stars really were in contact with the Yishuv's or Israel's magazines and did not entirely belong to an unreachable realm. Above all, writers in the Yishuv in Israel brought their world closer to major film centers that made real movies by showing what the two already had in common, namely Jews. Whatever additional arguments were given, the Jewish component was, to an astonishing degree, touted as the ultimate proof that filmmaking and the land of Israel were inseparable. That Israel's film industry was not a resounding success was met with surprise and as a fact that needed explanation. As late as 1967, A History of World Cinema opened its chapter on Israel by conceding, although the Jews hold important key positions in the film industry throughout the world, in Israel, unexpectedly, Davka, the cinema has not evolved quickly. This was typical. The Jewish body, Jewish lineage, and Jewish political cliques were all a source of pride in these publications. In 1947, beneath a photograph of the then recently deceased Ernst Lubitsch, a film magazine explained, his face expresses gravity and wisdom, and his countenance, Areshet Panav, emphasizes the typical Jewish character. That's a compliment. Film director Mervyn LeRoy was described as a Jew, I'm quoting, who inherited from his forefathers the tenacity and genius for creation. A 1954 biography of director Sergei M. Eisenstein repeatedly mentioned that he was Jewish and claimed that he was one of the leaders of the Moscow anti-Jewish committee. The volume, scope, and frequency, if not accuracy, of attributing Jewishness to filmmakers was astounding. Their fascination with the presence of Jews in the world of moving pictures could rival anti-Semitic rants about Jews controlling the media. As many as half of readers' letters in a single issue could be questions about who is and who isn't Jewish, including Leni Riefenstahl. She's not. After any name and in any context, the title Jew or Jewish or Jewess might have been added, and numerous lists of Jews in the world of cinema were published. Jewish filmmakers in Hollywood, Europe, India, and Egypt, in the present and the past, men and women, individuals, crews, and entire studios. Sometimes it was the topic of a story, and sometimes awkwardly tacked on. There are cases where I found items that had been published in American film magazines. They were translated into Hebrew, and then they just added Jew or Jewess in parentheses throughout the article. And sometimes invented original Jewish names. There was even, really, a regular Jew of the Week column titled Jews in the World of Film that made sure readers would never doubt the prevalence of Jews in the field. I think you can see Betty Davis here. They claimed that she had Jewish heritage. She did not. And Humphrey Bogart is kind of borderline because his wife was Jewish, Lorraine Bacall, so he lived in a Jewish household, technically. That's what they write. But sometimes they just invented it. Sometimes it was correct. Small wonder members of the Yishuv and Israelis were certain that Paul Mooney and the Warner Brothers would be natural allies in the cinematic aspirations of their own historic homeland. Whereas other emerging film industries perhaps hoped that they would one day become the new Hollywood, Israelis were certain that the old Hollywood would one day come to them. It was their homeland after all. In contrast with some readings of Zionist cinema as hailing a new Hebrew identity, which was the negation of the Nebush old diasporic Jew, members of the Yishuv and Israelis were happy to view themselves as part of a Jewish cinematic world that was already thriving in Hollywood and Europe. They did not feel that their own Zionist identity required them to sever ties with the diasporic Jewishness of Paul Mooney or the Warner Brothers, for example, and Zionist and Israeli filmmakers and cinephiles repeatedly expressed a desire to rejoin or emulate their co-religionists abroad. This went beyond an instrumental wish to benefit from ties to powerful Jews. At least when dealing with cinema, some Israeli writers allowed themselves to express an outright longing for the world of the diaspora as such. Journalist Uri Keisari has been credited by Oz Almog and Dan Almagor with coining the term Sabra to designate Jews born in the land of Israel in contradistinction with diasporic Jews. Keisari was a Sabra. However, he seemed to have no interest in keeping the two apart in his 1937 review of the Yiddish musical Idol with His Fiddle. Yiddish films were screened in the land of Israel, dubbed into Hebrew, supposedly the epitome of the Zionist negation of the diaspora. Keisari, however, was not fooled by what his ears heard. This was a diasporic Jewish film, and he was all for Klimt. The film, he opined, was a good film and an excellent Jewish film. Its Jewishness was hardly a barrier for Sabras, since the Jewish heart awakened to the call of the Jewish heart. Writing within the confines of a myopic Ashkenazi imaginary, Keisari claimed that all Jews, those born in Nalevki in Warsaw, Broadway, Thessaloniki, Tel Aviv, were tied together despite the different passports in their pockets. The film awakened an ancient connection. Its Jewish, specifically Jewish content is what makes it into something warm and good-hearted, something familial, something concealed from the eye and inexplicable, that very much has the power to awaken and stir in you an atavism that has slumbered in your depth and which guides you through unseen threads to the hidden village in Polish or Russian territory decades ago, when your grandfather or the grandfather of grandfather breathed and lived and suffered and loved in the very same atmosphere as Idol mitten Fiddle. But this was not just a connection to world Jewry through shared nostalgia. Keisari saw his own reality as part of this Jewish world. He tied the film's potential commercial success in the land of Israel to filmmaking there. We in the land of Israel must not protest such a local commercial victory of an Yiddish film, he wrote, because after all, we want Jewish films to be made about our place. Keisari could find room for both old and new Jews, both diasporic Jewishness and the Hebrew Sabra. Today, there are Jews who call for a departure from Zionism by negating the negation of the diaspora and placing dispersal as an ideal. They might end up finding an Israeli like Keisari patiently waiting for them with open arms at the end of the dialectic. In conclusion, there certainly was a substantial and vibrant discourse on film in the Yishuv in Israel before academic Israeli film studies. It poses considerable hermeneutic and historiographical challenges. The films that have traditionally been read in relation to the Yishuv or Israel were viewed by the local discourse as detested productions calculated to cater to foreign audiences. This does not mean that ideological elements are not to be found in these texts, but that they are only one layer that should now be placed in relation to wider dynamics. Perhaps we would need to wreak effect to some psychoanalytic workhorses like disavowal, projection, and within the films, reaction formation. Historical categories that were maybe clear to them are lost on us today. Modern interpreters have not been able to distinguish between Zionist propaganda that has too much Zionism in quotation marks and Zionist propaganda that does not. Not only because the term might have been fuzzy and inconsistently used, but also because of the temporality it unfolds. It refers to depictions they felt were dated within films that, to later interpreters, were all already dated. As for the future, some of them formulated concrete plans, but many were nebulous calls for action or collective pep talks, more potentials or virtualities than actual worked out possibilities. Surprisingly, what probably originated as vague fantasies in popular film magazines was actualized in real policies. The Israeli government, for example, actively solicited the support of Jews in Hollywood, both as diplomats with powerful lobbying connections in Washington and for propaganda projects like Exodus, the Leon Uris book, and the United Artists film. Finally, many of the works I looked at imagine futures that now belong to pasts that never took place. They've become what-if scenarios of alternative or virtual histories. In them, a Jewish homeland would have peacefully become part of a multilingual and multi-ethnic Middle East, and Cairo would have been its cinematic lodestone. As late as 1950, studio co-founder Margot Klausner suggested that her new studio's laboratory could be used for developing films for the entire Middle East. Didn't happen. Metaphysically, these counterfactual histories might attest to the contingency of history, which follows no plan. Things could have been, and perhaps still can be, different. Less sanguinely, perhaps they demonstrate our limited epistemological capacity to comprehend events as they're taking place around us and understand our roles in what would subsequently become history. For us, they're perhaps a reminder that our protests need to be more ambitious. Thank you.
So thank you. I learned a lot, actually, from this. A lot. I'm really curious about your perspective or other people's perspectives that you have gathered about I would say the rising importance, you mentioned it, of how Israeli films play in the United States. And so I think it was Eitan Fox's Walk on Water that was like the first Israeli film that made a lot of money in the U.S. I'm not sure that's true, but since then, as you say, you have Fauda, you have Shtisel, now you have No Other Land, you have. I guess I have two questions about it. One is it as important to the Israeli filmmakers and critics how their films are doing in America, or is this just something that we pay attention to here? And the other is, does it create a kind of dissonance where people feel like, wait, you're making all these films for them, why aren't you making films for us? Or the third question is there a whole separate film industry for the Israelis that we never see? So wow. Those are my questions.
Thank you. The answer to all three is yes. Um, most of the films that are successful abroad appear in film festivals, and they usually premiere outside of Israel, wherever they're accepted, at Cannes, Venice, wherever they can. In Israel, we read about them, unless we happen to be at Cannes. And then they would open in Israel later with posters that say it already won or was screened at Cannes, was selected for Cannes. So it's part of the promotion. These are films that already belong to an era in which films are kind of an elite occupation. You don't just go to the movies every day. Television has replaced that. Now it's streaming. And that shift happens around the 1980s in Israel. Up to that, there was a popular film industry with a few quality films. From the 1980s, you see a shift. Some films start appearing in festivals and doing better outside of Israel than in Israel. You have Beyond the Walls about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Gilal Magor's Avia's Summer, a Holocaust film. And you can see them starting to make headlines abroad, being picked up by Warner's for international distribution. Nominations for Academy Awards restarted that period. So that gradually happens. And these are, I'll say, quality films or festival films. And they cater to a specific audience in Israel that looks for these foreign films, basically. So they'd go see Swedish films, German films, and Israeli films that won awards. Popular Israeli cinema has different periods. Right now, it's doing pretty well. These are films that are usually not screened outside of Israel. They're often tied to television programs, appeal to youth or to children. They're usually comedies. And they don't travel that much. What was the other? Yeah.
Is there a discomfort within the Israeli film industry? Like, why are we making films for them and not for us?
Yes, and it's very productive. In the popular films, you might find someone making a festival film and being mocked for it. So you'll have a parody about the Bible, which is for internal use. It's basically a television program that was made into a feature film. And somebody is like filming the Canaanites and describing them as if they were Palestinians. And he's making a left-wing documentary film and being mocked for that. So they're very much aware of this discourse. And I think a film like Synonyms, about an Israeli in France, and the difficulties of shedding off his Israeliness, is about being a filmmaker who's more successful abroad than in Israel. So I think it's internalized in the films. And there's also a political discourse against the festival films by the populist right wing that thinks that they're not for Israelis, that they're anti-Israeli propaganda. And I think that can be found in other populist regimes as well. Thank you so much.
And I should mention, Boaz is too modest, but he has a brilliant essay on Walk on Water in Camera Obscura, right?
Yeah.
So I encourage people to check out. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say Beyond the Walls was a very successful film in that it got picked up by a studio who was willing to spend the money, although it did not make back the money. But that was a really important time in the early 80s when the film was released.
I think that was really the beginning.
Yeah, it was. But anyways, I'm curious on the early years of Israeli cinema and what's going on right now. To what extent did the Lumiere brothers, their silent films about being in Palestine, have any impact on those who were trying to make films at those times in the land of Israel? And I also know there was a Russian filmmaker who came to make what really was propaganda films to bring people from, I guess, it must have been Tsarist Russia, to the land of Israel. So did those early, let's say, international directors have any impact on the those in the land of Israel that were trying to make films?
Thank you. I couldn't find anyone mentioning the Lumiere brothers in the early decades. It appears in much later histories. What they did have is the Zionists coming from Poland or Russia, making a film, going back, sometimes dubbing it abroad in Hebrew, not in the land of Israel, and that really upset them. They felt they were in competition with them. But the Zionist bodies that funded the films wanted good films, and so they brought the best directors and crews they could. So you can see this competition. They're asking for funding, help us build labs, or just find film stock. It was very basic. And the Zionist bodies aren't sure they want to invest in local land of Israelis, or Palestinians, as they were called. Another interesting thing I was asked about is whether there was a local Arab cinema. And as far as I could tell from research on Palestinian cinema, it came after Jewish Zionist cinema. And we don't have any record of substantial film culture in Arabic. There are no Arabic film magazines or much writing about that. And that's thanks to the Americans. The Department of Commerce had reports on film markets throughout the globe, so the Hollywood studios could take over. And they had a report on Palestine. So they list the various newspapers in Arabic and Hebrew. And according to them, there were only film magazines in Hebrew. So I don't think they were reacting to the Lumieres, and I don't think they were reacting to local Arab film culture. They were reacting to Cairo, for example.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have many questions. I'll try to narrow it to two. In the British mandate, I was wondering materially if there were limitations set by the mandate on production of cinema in Israel, either materially, like limiting, the development of labs, etc., or censorship. And also, and this is, more from the literary side, I know that during this time, writers in Hebrew were less influenced by the Anglophone world and more French and Russian, especially due to kind of political objections to the mandate. But it seems that this was very different in the context of cinema, where Hollywood was a kind of prominent locale of influence. I was wondering if you have anything, thoughts about it.
Thank you. I don't know that the British could limit production. They could stop the exhibition, the distribution of films. There was a censorship board, and they censored a lot. Bride of Frankenstein was banned in Palestine. Some Italian neorealist films they thought were too political. And when the State of Israel was founded and the films were screened, the posters were very proud, authorized by the Israeli government because they don't need the British mandates board. So the censorship was part of the discourse. Yeah. Sure. As for material, I know in one case they gave material to filmmakers. Natan Axelrod, during World War II, didn't have any film stock. They commissioned Arabic films for him on agriculture, which he made in Arab villages with the Palestine Broadcasting Authority, with radio announcers in Arabic narrating the films. So he received film stock from the British. As for the American influence, up to the 1930s, the people who wrote, not necessarily the public, loved Russian films, French films, and German films, even after the rise of the Nazis to power. They wanted to see them. They didn't feel good about it, so they found all kinds of excuses. It was a film made before the Nazis rose to power. It's in German, but it's okay. They're supposed to boycott them, but they don't really. Or it's an Austrian film, a Swiss film. They find all kinds of excuses to screen them. And during World War II, the European market just stops. I mean, they won't take German films. The Brits aren't doing as well. And that's when the Americans really take over the market. Israelis love the films. And it's no longer the same European elites who are writing or only viewing the film. But when we're talking about the Yishuv, the 70,000 people there, a lot of them are intellectuals, at least in Tel Aviv. And they really, really passionately argue about the merits of German film versus Soviet film, depending on their politics. And it's quite striking to see it, say, in 1935, after the Nazis rise to power, they still believe German cinema is better. Thank you.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, Roni, please.
Thank you for this really interesting and informative talk. I was curious about two things. One is there's an interesting conflation in terms of time between the rise of the talkies and when people in Palestine are anxious about Hebrew speech and exactly how to articulate and how to pronounce words. And so like the emergence of Land of Israel kind of Hebrew. So I wonder if they write anything about that, like what the Hebrew should sound like in the film and whatever. So that's interesting for me. And the second is maybe about the propaganda stuff. So I don't know I know very little about film, but my understanding is that actually propaganda films are important in how film historians discuss the emergence of film techniques and whatever. So is there writing in the context of the Zionist propaganda films about, new imagery, methodologies that emerge through these productions?
Thank you so much. I know there's work by linguists that make use of the films. I haven't read it, so I can't recommend something specific. The discourse is quite interesting. They don't talk about pronunciation in the films. I don't think they felt it was strange, although to us it sounds with a heavy Russian or Polish accent. But at the time it must have seemed natural to them. There is a discourse about how dangerous films are. And one of the really wonderful ways it happened is in a mock trial in Tel Aviv. They decided to put cinema on trial. So people were invited to...
What year?
It's in the 1930s. There were at least 2 trials during the Yishuv period and a few more during the Israel period. And this was a massive event with thousands of tickets sold in advance. It was cheaper if you were a poel, a worker. And serious intellectuals like Bialik were arguing whether films were good or bad, whether they would harm Hebrew literature or Hebrew theater. And they had all kinds of suggestions. Maybe cinemas should sell Hebrew books or pay a tax to support the Hebrew theater. And they were really worried about the fate of the Hebrew language because the films were so attractive once they were talkies, and especially the idea of an earworm. You'd go to a German musical and start humming the songs in German, and that was a serious danger because you weren't conscious of it. And it was an entire debate. We don't have the trial. We have reports from newspapers about it. The verdict basically said they should make films in Hebrew and make better films in Hebrew. They didn't say they had to sell books in movie theaters. So it was rare, but it was a really interesting public event that was really sold out, and they had another one. But yeah, they kept talking about what would happen to the Hebrew language because of German or Russian films.
Great. Further questions from the audience? Maybe while people are thinking, I'll ask a question myself, if that's all right. So I have students here from a class on philosophy and film, and I wanted to press you a little bit on the terms that you're using to describe the material. So you talk a lot about film discourse. You also invoke ideas about the film industry and its place in the world, and you referenced work on early film theory in different geopolitical contexts. And I wonder, for one, what's the difference between those terms, discourse, ideas, film theory, or film philosophy for you, if those are meaningful distinctions? And then you close the talk a bit with, one, kind of a denaturalization of ideas of Zionism. And I wonder if this is a kind of Foucauldian genealogy that's trying to denaturalize or question, a term that many take for granted or nowadays. But you also mentioned futures past, which is a kind of, Reinhard Koselleck way of approaching history in terms of, as you said, alternative or counterfactual history. So I wonder if there's a certain kind of theorist you have in mind with this historiographical project as well.
Wow, let's see if I remember everything. Discourse is anything they said about films. So some of it was ideas, some of it was theory, a lot of it could be gossip. The interesting thing for histories of film theory is that they use the term theory. They immediately recognize that certain works were theory. There's a debate whether theory is a retrojection that only happened in retrospect, and people didn't know they were doing theory, maybe only in the 1970s when we have readers. We called certain writers theorists, and it's very clear that they know who the theorists are. It's Arnheim, it's Balash. They call them theorists. They have chapters in books called film theory, which is not film history. So it's a term they used. As you know, I love the word because of its etymology. In ancient Greek, it designated a pilgrimage, leaving your polis, going to another polis or to a Panhellenic event like the Olympic Games, and then coming back after having been changed, after undergoing a religious conversion, the mysteries, taking part in a festival, and bringing something foreign back to the polis. These were the theorists, the original theoroi. Some of them were executed because they worshipped foreign gods. Some of them brought new knowledge, and some of them were required to remain silent so they wouldn't corrupt the polis. So this idea of foreignness, I think, is very interesting in the context of what we have here. Journalists going abroad, reporting back to Israel. Menachem Golan, when he moved to the US, came back to Israel from a premiere, and he reported to journalists about the state of the industry. So I like theory also in that sense. I think they were theorists in that sense. What else? Whether it's a Foucauldian challenge, I don't think so. I think they called it Zionism, so I can't say at a certain stage different things that weren't Zionism suddenly became Zionism, say like homosexuality or different forms of punishment, and suddenly you have the convict or something like that. I don't think I can say that. But there definitely were more Zionisms than some of us remember today. And that's apparent there. What I was trying to say about the futures that never happened is that maybe we should look at them as not as possibilities, but as potentials or virtualities that can be actualized in unpredictable ways, which is, I think, more Deleuzian or Bergsonian than anything else. And it's really interesting to see how these, not ideas, but potentials were actualized in very, very diverse ways. The strangest is probably Menachem Golan. He and his cousin took over an American film company in 1979, Canon. They invested in it heavily, and there's an interesting story there. And they became a mini major, a Hollywood distributor that distributed more films than the legacy majors like MGM, Warner's, Paramount. They were massive. And a lot of the films they distributed were produced by Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus in Israel. They built a new studio, they built an entire infrastructure, and they basically realized the dream of American Jews building the Israeli industry. But they grew up on these fantasies in Israel, then went to the US and realized that. And they were compared to the old Jewish moguls in the American press because they were crass and had heavy accents. So that's something really unpredictable, the way a kind of seed of an idea might be actualized in a way that I don't think they thought about. And that's why I don't think it was a possibility, but maybe a potential or a virtuality.
Yes.
Sam Spielberg, did he have, I mean, his story is amazing. I just read his biography. Was he involved in promoting Israeli films later in life? Because he lived in Palestine in the 1920s, but then was in Hollywood. Did he ever get involved? And did he ever?
I don't know, but there was a story when he moved to Hollywood about the Eretz Israeli, about the member of the Yishuv who was successful in Hollywood. So no, he was someone from Palestine who could make it in Hollywood. That was a big thing. It means that we can make films. So I think he was inspirational either way, but I don't know whether.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Who else would like to jump in at this point?
Yeah. And of course, it's the name of a film school.
Right.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Sorry, this has to do with present day or the last 20 years. There's been a proliferation of film schools in Israel. So the school in the south, the Jerusalem school that's a religious school, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, the art school, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
How has that changed the landscape of Israeli cinema? Has it had an impact? Are there more audiences now for films that might be telling stories about religious and observant people? I'm just curious to know.
Wow, thank you. That would require a counterfactual. What would have happened if we didn't have Male? Would it have been the same? Because of the film festival market, which is the way these films are initially distributed, I think the world is looking for films about religious Jews, about the South, about not stories about Tel Avivians and the kind of stories you can find anywhere. So I think it might have happened even if there hadn't been as many film schools. But what we have is a new mediascape where there are many, many avenues for moving images to be made. It's not only cinemas or only network television, right? There's cable, satellite television, the web. So I think there's actually jobs for everyone. Not necessarily making motion pictures. You know, it could be producing commercial, like films for industry or things like that. But there's really a place for everyone, and I think it's really exciting. Sam Spiegel, the school in Jerusalem, was kind of an evolution of an earlier school that was part of a theater school and was kind of looked down upon by the theater people. So they split it, but it had already been around for decades in some variation. Thank you.
Great. I think we're just on time. So thank you again to Boaz Hagin for a fabulous talk.